Então, bem-vindos nesta mesa número 11 da Flip, com o título Por que escrevo? Com Deborah Levy e William Finnegan. O título da mesa é emprestado do famoso ensaio autobiográfico do George Orwell, Por que escrevo?, publicado em 1946. Foi em resposta a esse ensaio que a nossa convidada Deborah Levy escreveu o próprio ensaio Coisas que não quero saber, Things I Don't Want to Know. Traduzido e lançado aqui no Brasil agora pela editora Autêntica, na tradução da Celina Portocarrero. Deborah nasceu na África do Sul, mas a família teve que sair do país quando ela tinha apenas 9 anos, devido ao ativismo anti-apartheid do pai. Então ela cresceu e ainda mora em Londres. Deborah tem uma distinguidíssima trajetória como poeta, dramaturga, contista e romancista. Seus romances Swimming Home e Hot Milk foram finalistas do prêmio Man Booker, no Reino Unido. E, aliás, Swimming Home foi lançado no Brasil como Nadando de Volta para Casa, traduzido por Léa Viveiros de Castro e publicado pela Rocco. E é um grande prazer ter ela aqui. So, welcome, Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
William Finnegan, Bill, nasceu em Nova York, mas cresceu em Califórnia e Havaí. Ele já era conhecido como um dos notáveis repórteres da revista New Yorker, cobrindo guerras, conflitos políticos na África, na América Latina, nos Estados Unidos. Mas no ano 2015, ele saiu do armário como surfista doido, apaixonado, e publicou o livro de memórias Dias Bárbaros, Uma Vida no Surf. O livro está sendo lançado aqui no Brasil pela Intrínseca, na tradução de Edmundo Barreiros. É um grande prazer ter ele aqui para mergulhar nessa pergunta e entender por que ele escreve. Então, Bill, it's very good to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks. Thank you.
So, moving into English now. Deborah, the title of our event is Why I Write. Obviously, this is taken from George Orwell's essay, to which you've responded in your own essay, which is now being published here. So, just to kick off our conversation, can you tell us a little bit about how this essay came about?
Yes, I can. First of all, my big thank you to my publishers here in Brazil, Autêntica, and to the translators, because without you, I would not be here. So my sincere thanks for allowing this conversation to happen. So in 1946, George Orwell wrote a very short essay called Why I Write. And he had 4 motivations: historical impulse, political purpose, aesthetic enthusiasm, and sheer egoism. I thought they were pretty good. You know, I thought, what would I add to that in an essay? And I had thoughts like, well, for myself, words and language must always open the mind and not close the mind. But then I reckoned, well, you could put that into aesthetic enthusiasm or political purpose. So I decided to take his 4 headings and give them a spin from a female writer's point of view. And that was the beginning of the book.
One of the things you remark on is that when George Orwell was talking about sheer egoism as being one of the things that drives a writer, he certainly was not thinking about women writers. So his was a very male perspective, so you decided to upend that.
Yeah, I mean, it is very powerful to be able to walk anyone who lives in the margins right into the center of a fiction or of an essay. But I had some fun with sheer egoism because Things I Don't Want to Know starts with the narrator in middle age, my age, then goes back to childhood, around the age of 7, and then to age 15. And I have sheer egoism at 15 because by that time I'd been living in Britain for 6 years. I was born in South Africa, and I'd read some of the existentialists. Excuse me. So I'd read a little bit of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and Camus, and I thought that really I wanted to be an existentialist writing in cafes on the left bank in Paris. But in the late 70s in Britain, there were no cafes like that. And anyway, I would have no money to buy a Pernod, an aperitif like Simone de Beauvoir. But I discovered a cafe in a bus station. In Britain, it's called a Greasy Spoon. It's like a working man's cafe where all the bus drivers went in to have breakfast, eggs, beans, sausage, bacon, and I went in there to write, pretending to be Simone de Beauvoir. And I discovered something really great, which is that if you're a young woman in a cafe full of men, and you're writing away, probably writing rubbish, on the serviettes, no one talks to you. No one interrupted me. So the pen was just like something very powerful to make a space of silence around me.
Mm. On the subject of women and writing, there's a line from the essay. You say, a female writer cannot afford to feel her life too clearly. If she does, she will write in a rage when she should write calmly. Can you tell us a little bit more about this idea?
That's a quote from Virginia Woolf. And, Virginia Woolf, who was a very great writer, said, well, if you just write from anger, you're screaming all over the page, you have no nuance, you have no complexity. And this is in part true, but I'm also a believer. I believe in anger as a motivation to write, because it's sometimes when we're most angry that we tell the truth, not just to other people, but we feel the truth for the first time for ourselves. So it's that moment when you suddenly, your heart starts to beat and you say something you really mean. And it's true that you can go back and do another draft and you can finesse it and make it more elegant. But actually, I think that very first flush of anger is a very important part of writing.
Mm. You're going to read from your book to give us a taste of the text.
Yes. So that's the Brazilian version, which I'm very proud of, like my baby. I'm just going to see if I can stand up, because I have the microphone on my handbag. This is a very short section of my book. I was born in 1959 in apartheid South Africa, and my mother and my father were involved in the struggle for human rights at that time. And my father was teaching African children to read and write, which was illegal, and a member of the African National Congress with Nelson Mandela and all those people of that generation. And he became a political prisoner for 4 years. So he disappeared when I was 5 and came back when I was 9. And then we had to leave South Africa, and we lived in Britain. So the only way that I could write about that time was really from a child's point of view, because I left when I was 9. And I had never told this, I'd never thought this was an important story for me to tell. But under the title Historical Impulse, I began it. 2 years later, I was 7 years old, and Dad was gone, but my mum said he would be back. I stared into my Barbie doll's painted-on eyes and thought about this. My father was gone. He was gone because he was a member of the African National Congress and the government had banned it, and because he was fighting for equal human rights. Everyone had to be brave. I searched my doll's blue eyes for any sign of her not being brave. To my relief, I found none at all, because her eyes had been painted on. She was as calm and pretty as it was possible to be, and I wanted to be like that too. I was glad my doll came with 4 wigs and a hairdryer, because Barbie was clearly untouched by anything horrible that happened in the world. I wished I had blue eyes that were painted on with long black eyelashes. I wanted eyes that held no secrets. Where's your father then? Because there were no secrets to hold. He's in a dungeon being tortured. Barbie was plastic, and I wanted to be plastic too. At school, I tried to speak. It was a big effort to make my words come out loud. The volume of my voice had somehow been turned down. All day, I was asked to repeat what I just said, to speak louder, but I couldn't speak louder. I tried to, but my voice wouldn't come out loud. Are you dumb? I told the children that my father was away in England. Where? England. I wasn't really sure where England was or where exactly my father was, but my Afrikaans teachers stared at me as if they knew everything. I was thinking about that phrase, out of the blue. It was so thrilling to think that things came out of the blue. There was a blue, and things came out of it. It was big and mysterious. It was like mist or gas, and it was like a planet. But it was also like a human head. Out of the blue, my teacher asked me how I spelt my surname. It was obvious to me she knew my father was a political prisoner, but then she said in an excited voice, "Yes, you are Jewish," as if she'd just discovered something incredible, like a Roman coin stuck in the paw of a kitten, or a dragonfly concealed in a loaf of bread. And then she blinked her liver-colored eyelashes and said, I've had enough of your nonsense. Her comment did not come out of the blue, not at all. The clue was that for weeks now she'd been writing angry things in my school exercise books. Always write on the top line. Start here. I had ignored her red biro correction because writing on the top line was impossible. I did not know why, but I always started on the third line. So there was a gap between the top of the page and the line I started on. She said I was wasting paper, and she had filled the empty spaces between the first and third line on every page with her own writing. Start here, start here, start here. When she shook her finger at me, it was as if it had gone right through my eye, like a ghost slipping through a brick wall. Read out loud to me what I've written in your book, she said. I can't hear you. You've written, start here. Yes. Why are you the only child in my class who thinks she can start where she likes? Take your books and go to the headmaster's office. He is expecting you. That came right out of the blue. I didn't really want Mr. Sinclair to be expecting me. As I carried the offending exercise books under my arm, I peered through the window into the other classrooms. In class 1J, there was a boy called Pete, who had a purple mark on his forehead like a bullet wound. All the children knew that a teacher had shaved his hair and dabbed iodine onto his forehead with a ball of cotton wool because he had sworn in class. Now his forehead was stained purple, so everyone could see he'd done something wrong. I wondered whether the mark would ever go away. When I learned about Jesus Christ and the way the nails were hammered through the palms of his poor carpenter's hands, I thought of Pete. So to the translator, I'm going to skip a little bit on. The bridge looked over the playground. All the white children were in their classrooms, but 3 black children, 2 boys and a girl, had climbed over the gate and were turning over the dustbins. The African children were barefoot, and the girl was wearing a yellow dress with only one sleeve. Her hair was cut close to her head, like Tandiwi's hair. Sometimes Tandiwi and I washed each other's hair in the bath with a slab of soap. When we got the soap in our eyes, we had to splash our faces with water to try and find a towel with our eyes shut. We bumped into each other because the stinging soap had blinded us, but we were not as blind as we pretended to be. We liked to bump into each other. From my view on the bridge, I could see that the little girl had found some bread, and one of the boys had found a green sock. He put it in his pocket, and then he looked up and saw me watching him. When he looked up, I ducked down, and then I peered over the bridge again. I would be safer with the children than I would be with Mr. Sinclair, who was expecting me.
Thank you, Deborah. So this is the beginning of sort of a career of rebelling against being told where to write and how to write. Can you tell us about the moment slightly later on in your life when you were encouraged to raise your voice, and then you decide, I will raise my voice, but I will do it on paper.
So then I was sort of mute for about a year. I just didn't speak at school. And one teacher said to me, "Why don't you write your thoughts down?" So I did. I began to write my thoughts down, and I discovered they were very loud, and that I liked writing them down. And that was the beginning of thinking that I could do more of that. So the words on my book are, to become a writer, I had to learn to interrupt, to speak up, to speak a little louder, and then just to speak in my own voice, which is not loud at all.
Thank you. Bill, you've written a book of memoir about your surfing days. You've said yourself that it was sort of coming out as a surfer, and you had some hesitation about doing this. So you did not want to reveal your passion for this to your colleagues. Why was there hesitation about doing that?
Well, I'd also like to thank my publishers, Intrinsica, for having me able to come here, and thank you everybody for coming. I don't know about surfers in Brazil, but there's a strong stereotype of surfers in the USA and other countries too, as not exactly bookish, and not exactly ready to argue about national policy, foreign policy from an informed point of view, which is what I was doing. I'm a political journalist by trade. I'm a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine. I've been there since the 80s. And so that's sort of my public life, my public side. And I have this other life as a surfer, serious surfer, since I was a kid. And I wanted to write about it to try to account for all this time spent doing this kind of useless, irresponsible thing while I was this kind of responsible citizen in public. But I was nervous. I thought by coming out of the closet, as it were, by the way, I'm a surfer, I would no longer be taken seriously as a political commentator or a political reporter. And that turned out to not be a problem, actually. I mean, nobody said anything, but it was a long hesitation to write about this other side of my life. And I want to say, in contrast to Deborah's struggles to define her voice and the theme of being urged to talk louder, which comes up in other contexts in this book. And you must read this just to see at least what happens when she gets to the headmaster at the school, which I didn't completely understand and I need to ask you about. But anyway, as a boy in the US, I had nothing similar. Okay? It was other things that caused me to want to write, other inhibitions that I had to overcome to write, but nothing comparable to what I think you can universalize to say what women in general must overcome to. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Maybe not some places now, but broadly and generally, it's I mean, Orwell's reasoning or reasons, which are a little slightly opaque to me, but nonetheless could apply to me. They don't include the feeling of being silenced.
Yes.
which is so powerful in this book and so powerful in many people's experience. Sorry, a little sidelight, but...
You object to people calling surfing a sport, or it's not how you would describe this activity.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, I have no objection, really, to people calling it a sport, but the great majority of people who practice this thing, who do this thing, do it in a kind of non-competitive context. That is, say it's not organized, it's disorganized, or it's organized around the ocean, not around any kind of athletic federations or anything. Maybe different again in Brazil, but that's what I grew up with in California and Hawaii. And the increasing kind of sportification, that's a horrible word, that's not a good word. The increasing transformation of surfing into a sort of an official sport is now going to be included in the Olympics in a few years in Tokyo, is horrible to me. And maybe I would say to most surfers, that is, there's a kind of surf industry, surfboard manufacturers, wetsuits, board shorts, sunglasses, all the things that can be sold through surfing, and contest organizers, and on and on and on. They're very happy to see surfing go to the Olympics. That's a way to, make money. But that's not in the interests of surfers who do this thing that has a terrible overpopulation problem. Too many people are doing it. The good waves are terribly crowded and competitive, and I get questions sometimes, what's your favorite wave? Because I've traveled a lot around looking for waves, and it becomes meaningless because the great waves all have too many people. You can't see the wave, you can't surf the wave anymore. So surfers sort of wish that if I can speak for a lot of surfers, would say that we hope it just becomes unpopular, forgotten, uncool, more and more, and not the Olympics, no, please. So that's my objection to the sport thing. It's just the sort of overpopulation problem. And surfing is not good for you. It's really not a good thing to start.
I learned the word you use for people, those amateurs who are out there crowding the waves, is kooks?
Well, amateurs as opposed to professionals, that's me. Kooks is it's a Hawaiian word. You might have learned it in Hawaii. It's an obnoxious term. It's a terrible term. Do they use it in Brazil as well? Kooks? Yeah? It's kind of, no, they don't. Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. Because it's a term that surfers use to, who's there? Oh, it's just some kooks, meaning like people who don't really surf very well. And it's a kind of brutal term. I mean, if a surfer says to another surfer, you're a kook, immediately it's a fight. It's like a terrible thing to say. So
I'd be interested to just, with a show of hands, to see how many people in this room are surfers or enjoy surfing. Anyone? Okay, a few.
A few. So I say surfing and books don't necessarily go together.
I think you've sort of proved that premise is wrong. So.
Well, most of my readers are not surfers.
You're going to read from your book.
Yes. Just a short passage from the first section of my book. It's about when I was a kid in Hawaii, about maybe 13 or 14. Actually, maybe trying to distinguish a little bit surfing from other sports. I've been surfing for a few years then, and we moved to Hawaii when I was 13, and the waves were a little bigger, more serious, very, very exciting for me, but one had to kind of confront the... Also, I don't really write about it here, but I was leaving the church. I was raised in the Catholic Church, and I had been confirmed, and I was just kind of, now I'm an adult in the eyes of the church. Okay, I'm not going to Mass. So I was kind of losing my faith right at this moment. and I try to describe surfing in this context of other sports and faith in Hawaii. But surfing always had this horizon, this fear line that made it different from other things, certainly from other sports I knew. You could do it with friends, but when the waves got big or you got into trouble, there never seemed to be anyone around. Everything out there was disturbingly interlaced with everything else. Waves were the playing field. They were the goal. They were the object of your deepest desire and adoration. At the same time, they were your adversary, your nemesis, even your mortal enemy. The surf was your refuge, your happy hiding place, but it was also a hostile wilderness, a dynamic, indifferent world. At 13, I had mostly stopped believing in God, but that was a new development, and it had left a hole in my world, a feeling that I'd been abandoned. The ocean was like an uncaring God, endlessly dangerous, power beyond measure. And yet you were expected, even as a kid, to take its measure every day. You were required, this was essential, a matter of survival, to know your limits, both physical and emotional. But how could you know your limits unless you tested them? And if you failed the test, you were also required to stay calm if things went wrong. Panic was the first step, everybody said, to drowning. As a kid, too, your abilities were assumed to be growing. What was unthinkable one year became thinkable, possibly, the next. My letters from Honolulu, I quote from these letters a lot in the first chapter. My letters from Honolulu in 1966, kindly returned to me recently, are less distinguished by swaggering bullshit than by frank discussions of fear. Don't think I've suddenly gotten brave. I haven't. But the frontiers of the thinkable were quietly, fitfully edging back for me. That was clear on the first big day I saw at Cliffs. This is a local spot in Honolulu where we live, Diamond Head Cliffs it was called. That was clear on the first big day I saw at Cliffs. A long period swell had arrived overnight. The sets, larger waves, which usually come in groups, were well overhead, glassy and gray, with long walls and powerful sections. I was so excited to see the excellence that my backyard spot could produce that I forgot my usual shyness and began to ride with the crowd at the main peak. I was overmatched there and scared, and I got mauled by the biggest sets. I wasn't strong enough to hold on to my board when caught inside by 6-foot waves, even though I turned turtle, rolled the board over, pulled the nose down from underwater, wrapped my legs around it, and got a death grip on the rails. The white water tore the board from my hands, then thrashed me, holding me down for long, thorough beatings. I spent much of the afternoon swimming. Still, I stayed out till dusk. I even caught and made a few meaty waves. And I saw surfing that day by Leslie Wong, among others, that made my chest hurt. Long moments of grace under pressure that felt etched deep in my being, what I wanted somehow more than anything else. That night, while my family slept, I lay awake on the bamboo-framed couch, heart pounding with residual adrenaline, listening restlessly to the rain. There you have it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill, elsewhere you write about surfing sort of filling a psychic cavity, having lost religion. And you describe the ocean waves as sort of an uncaring God, endlessly dangerous. So this really was sort of a religion, in a sense.
Yeah, it's a. I mean, the main thing about surfing is understanding. It's all about reading the ocean, reading waves, and that includes both a kind of analytic understanding, an ability to predict what the ocean's going to do next, based on a lot of experience, a lot of kind of close oceanographic study. And also, though, a realism, a sort of realistic understanding of what the ocean is likely to do to remove kind of wishful thinking, anthropomorphic thinking, where it's the ocean, which I love. Well, maybe you love the ocean, but the ocean does not love you back. There's no reciprocation here. And so it's always got to be this clear understanding of what's there. And in that sense, I mean, it's atheistic, or it's polytheistic or something. I mean, this enormous power to which you've kind of devoted yourself, but that you have to always be clear about, can kill you, not out of malice, not out of any feeling about you, but just from its sheer kind of transhuman power and violence. I mean, waves are violent, and as you get more serious about surfing, you're interested in more violent waves, not just bigger but more powerful, and being right close to that violence is the whole thing. Or that's not the whole thing. I mean, waiting and studying and lots of other parts are it. But I mean, the pinnacle of what you're looking for is right next to this very violent, natural event. So it's a weird kind of religion, huh? But it is, and I mean, survival, death is not like an immediate issue on a normal day of surfing, but it's always out there. As I was reading, the edge of what you're doing is a very serious question, and so it ranges up to there, and in that sense, it involves big questions.
I mean, the idea of a surfer reading the waves, reading the sea, takes me back to a conversation we started having earlier on. Both of you are very dedicated swimmers, and we began to discuss whether there is any connection between the act of swimming and surfing and riding. Deborah, what can you tell us about that?
Well, in some ways, that's a practical thing because when I write fiction, and I mostly write novels, it's like sitting down on a long-haul flight 12 hours later. You're kind of getting nearer your destination. So swimming is a way of really stretching the muscles. And I guess that different kinds of thoughts happen when I swim, a little bit like a meditation, because I swim under the water. So it's they're the sort of thoughts that I don't have perhaps when I write. And when I was writing my novel, Swimming Home, I just looked up what a swimming pool physically is. It sounds really obvious, but I always start with something, with the material reality, a bit like your lack of wishful thinking when the waves are coming your way. So a swimming pool is a hole in the ground. It's a bit like a grave covered with water. And we also start life in the womb, in water. So it's a bit like a womb and a grave in one. And Swimming Home, the novel, is set around a swimming pool, which is also a bit like a theatre. And I had a theatre training. I started off writing plays as a young woman, as a young writer. So a swimming pool has exits and entrances. People wear costumes. All of that stuff goes on. But it's mostly about allowing maybe awkward thoughts, thoughts that are more left of field, you know, more surprising thoughts come to me. I can solve problems in my novels
And the writing.
when I'm swimming, and then it's just nice to have water on your skin, and to be wet, and to have wet hair. When I'm really old, like 90 if I make it, I just only ever want to wear a swimming costume and be on a rock with the water by my feet and a typewriter.
Bill, you had some thoughts on this.
Well, no, for me, swimming has just been a defeat. That is, I spend so much time chasing waves and surfing. I don't feel like I have any time to swim or do anything else. I have to get to work. When I get out of the water, I need to get to work. But at a age started catching up with me, and I realized I live in New York City, in Manhattan, and I just realized if I don't do something, I'm not surfing every day, and if I haven't surfed for a few weeks, I get out there, you're weaker, you're slower, you're losing your timing. I realized I needed to do something every day where I lived, and so I took up swimming in defeat.
Do you swim under the water?
Yeah, I swim freestyle and then a certain number of laps. People think you're crazy, you're back and forth underwater. They don't understand you need to be able to hold your breath for what I do, so yes.
In the UK, most people swim with their heads up. So I always said to my friends, if they filled the swimming pools with tea, everyone would swim under the water.
Bill, you'd said something, surfing is very good training for someone who has to sit down and write just because of the amount of time you spend waiting for things.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm sure it's different for other writers, but surfing involves a tremendous amount of waiting. One of the reasons it has no future really as a spectator sport. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to watch surfing, but it's like watching paint dry. It's unbelievably boring. Mostly nothing happens at all. And so you learn a kind of patience surfing. You're waiting for waves. And I do that a lot at my desk. I'm waiting and I need to be patient. I don't have a good idea for the next word, the next sentence, the next section. And other writers may not have this, but if I am patient, I feel like it will come. And I've learned that patience more in the ocean than anywhere else.
Reading both your books, it seems to me that each is in its own way about identity and carving out an identity, whether it's Deborah sort of carving out this identity as a writer, a young writer in London, or whether it's Bill sort of finding your place in the world, sort of trying to catch the perfect wave and trying to fit into that community. Would that be a fair description?
Yeah, I mean, in my most recent novel, Hot Milk, I wonder how that translates in Portuguese. Hot milk. Hot milk.
Leite quente.
Okay. So I knew that would make you feel a little bit sort of queasy. Um, in, um, in Hot Milk, the main character is 25 years old, and she's called Sophia Papastergiadis. And her father is Greek, and her mother is English, born in Yorkshire. So Sophia is born in Britain, but she has a name, Papastergiadis. No one can spell it, no one can pronounce it. And so she has an identity that she doesn't really know how to carry because her father walked out of the family house when she was 5. So the Greek side of her family, it's very difficult for her to really embrace, know what to do with that identity. So I give her a problem, that problem, right from the start of the book. And it's a problem. Not a problem. It's something that I'm interested in because I also come from somewhere else. I'm very interested in names when I write. So in Swimming Home, I have one character, a British poet, who's really born in Poland. So he's called the British poet, the Polish poet. He's called all sorts of rude other names. He's Josef Nowogrodzki, and he's Joe Jacobs. So I'm interested in identities that slide around, because I think that's most of the world, really.
Mm. Bill, do you find that that's...
I don't know. Maybe I would just speak to that question as a writer. You know, I went through. I was a poet when I was young, and then I became a fiction writer, quite serious. I wrote 3 novels, and then went through an experience actually in South Africa. I was a novelist and a surf bum at the same time. And sort of bumming around the world looking for waves and writing novels. And I got a job and working jobs to survive. And the last job in that series that I got was teaching high school in Cape Town, outside Cape Town. This is in the bad old days of apartheid. And I was teaching in a black high school, and it was extremely intense year politically. The students went out on strike, protesting apartheid in education. The apartheid state hit back very hard. It got quite violent. And I was, in this community throughout this conflict, and some of our students and a lot of our students and some of my colleagues were imprisoned, and a lot of people were hurt and killed. And it was just such a experience for me. The sort of politics of it were so direct, and I admired the activists I came to know, both students and teachers and others, so much that I just lost, my sort of identity as a fiction writer. This kind of avant-garde romantic fiction I was writing suddenly felt, I don't know, irrelevant or silly or something I was leaving behind, and I started doing political journalism, with no training, and freelancing, and I came back to the U.S. and kind of got serious about writing for a living and writing about politics and power, and eventually South Africa. It took me a little while to sort of digest this experience and apply it to what I actually knew something about, which was South Africa. So this sounds all quite externally driven, but I saw myself so differently. To write a memoir like Barbarian Days, I use all these old journals of mine, and it's shocking to see how I saw myself. All my concerns when I was a kid or a teenager, say, were poetry and the poets I was reading and the poems I was working on, and then it became these novels, and then it became you know, the world outside myself, and how to translate that, how to get it accurately, how to get it clearly. You can see this kind of metamorphosis in my journals very clearly. So,
It's a very great book. It's Crossing the Line.
oh, thanks. That's about my experience teaching in Cape Town. Thank you.
Bill, I'd like to ask, there's a character in Deborah's novel, Swimming Home, who's a war reporter, who has been sort of severely sort of damaged by some of the things she's seen. And she is sort of trying to unsee some of these terrible things that she's been reporting on. I was wondering, sort of, when that character came up, and having sort of been reading your work, I was wondering if this is something that a war reporter like you are sort of feels is true.
It is true of war reporters that there's a lot of what in English is called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, same thing that a lot of soldiers get. I've known a lot of reporters to come down with that, where you can't go back to normal life, family life, because you're too troubled, just to put it simply. I haven't really suffered from that, no. I haven't. I mean, I've done a fair amount of war reporting, but it's a kind of it's a life. I mean, you actually see the same people at war after war after war. I have found. You know, now you're in Bosnia, now you're in El Salvador, now you're in Sudan, and it's just always this Somalia. Now it's the same people from the BBC, from different news organizations, and people who are really, that's what they do. They've got that look, and they're going to be suffering what we're describing. I've been more selective. I don't do news. I don't have to go and sit in Rwanda and record as much of the genocide. You know, it's not. The New Yorker is not a news magazine, so I will come in, spend a few weeks, do a big piece, and you know, I might not do another bit of war reporting for a year or two. And I've actually stopped now, so I haven't been traumatized in that way at all.
And neither is the character of Isabel in my book, Swimming Home, though she is a war reporter. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because we taught as children that to acquire knowledge is a very good thing. That's the point of life, to gather to us more knowledge. And actually, sometimes we want to unknow the things we know. Knowledge costs us. You can't sort of get rid of it once you have it. So that's a theme that interests me a lot. The psychoanalyst Lacan has a phrase that I think about. He says, maybe it would be better to live in, what does he call it? Passionate ignorance. Not passive ignorance, passionate ignorance. But Isabel, in Swimming Home, she's pressed up against the suffering world in her work. She has to record and witness. And I reversed the gender stereotype so that her husband, who is a poet, is mostly concerned with love, and she's mostly concerned with war. And their relationship is also sometimes it's love and sometimes it's war, like relationships usually are.
I must say, coming from a country now presided over by Donald Trump, I cannot agree with Lacan about the virtues of passionate ignorance. We're suffering now from an onset of passionate ignorance.
It's not that it's better to live in passionate ignorance. It's a phrase which I think we recognize, you know, when somebody's passionately ignorant, sort of proud of their ignorance. But in the days of Trump, that would be a whole conversation.
Yes, it's lost its charm.
Yeah.
Bill, I wondered whether writing a book like your memoir responded to some need to focus your mind on something that is about the pursuit of sheer beauty, which seems to be what you're doing very often in chasing those waves. Certainly from your descriptions of the waves and of that sort of marine landscape, you're engrossed in the beauty of it, and that's what you're chasing. And I wonder whether that was sort of a counterbalance to some of the very hard, harsh, difficult things you were writing about, you know, as part of the day job.
I've never really thought of it that way, but I think you're right. That is, it's a. I mean, there are times when it's been obvious that. I mean, for instance, I was in El Salvador at one point reporting, and had just a terrible day, and a bunch of reporters were killed, as well as other people, including a guy I was with, and I had to write immediately from, usually I get to go home to New York and take some time and work on my story, but this was very immediate. I had to sit there in El Salvador and write it and send it. And I was fairly traumatized that day. I've never quite gotten over that one day, but still it's not the sustained exposure you're talking about. Anyway, and to get over that, I like went to the beach. There's some great waves in El Salvador. In the middle of the war, there were no people surfing. So it was just, I had it to myself, and I surfed, and it was vivid. It was clear to me, this is what I need to do. This is what I need to do, is like, I'm crying on the beach, I'm crying in the water, but I'm surfing. And the contrast was there. But you're quite right that, I mean, so much of what I've written about, not everything, but much of what I write about is very dark, is people being really terrible to each other. I mean, starting in my case with apartheid and moving on to other terrible civil wars and other kinds of injustice. And to write about surfing in some detail, I don't tend to gild it or romanticize it, or I mean, many people have read this book and said, I thought I wanted to surf, and then I read your book. Whew, no thank you. So I mean, I describe what it's kind of actually like, but you're quite right that distilled to its essence, it's very much about the pursuit of beauty. And when people say, "Oh, what are you looking for? Are you looking for the perfect wave?" No. There's no perfect wave. It's not that, but it is this kind of drenching experience of beauty, which you can have. That is, I mean, other surfers know this is what you're after, and you cannot communicate it. You train for years and years and years to be able to be in that position, to have that brief moment, maybe a little bit longer. And that's what it's about. And writing about that, this book, was such a pleasure compared to my usual. I mean, it's always work and hard to get it right, but ultimately it was about something enriching, not and something personal, not about other people's, horrible problems. And it was a big contrast.
Deborah, this idea of sort of writing as pleasurable, do you find that to be true?
Yeah. I'm not a masochist. I think that writing is the big adventure in my life. It's the big surf. Sometimes I drown. But we usually get to dry land. So, yeah. And hopefully, that what Bill's talking about, that thing of being drenched in beauty. Well, on a good day, that's what reading's like. As well. Those are the books we keep with us for years and years. I guess for myself, I think I respect poets most, because poets can do everything. they can cut as close to human experience as it's possible to get without dying of pain, and somehow drench us with beauty too. And I like, there's one line by Apollinaire, the French poet Apollinaire. I want to open the window, I want to open the window like an orange. That's a very strange line, and I think that is what kind of writing is like. You want to open the world like an orange. And like surfing, most of writing is about looking and listening and paying attention.
You know, too often in sort of hackneyed descriptions of surfing, it's compared to sex, compared to making love. Oh, it was like you're making love to the wave, all that kind of thing. But a better analogy, really, in my experience, is reading something really great. Reading something that's just is also an incredible experience of beauty when it all comes together on the page. That's closer to my peak experiences of surfing. I'll say no more about sex.
There's a line in your essay which struck me, and you write that writing made me feel wiser than I actually was, wiser and sad. This was you as a young writer. Is it still the case?
No, not in the same way. So, you know, this is written sort of 50, age 7, age 15. But actually, my point in that sentence is that I think it's really important for young writers to write something they don't yet understand. So there is a culture at the moment, especially in the UK, of where you have to have complete coherence. You don't really reach for something that you don't entirely understand. And I think that it's good to take a risk, and then, as you write, to figure out what it is that you are reaching for. So that if the writing is too sensible,
I don't know if this is. Oh, sorry to interrupt.
if the writing is too closed, too prescriptive, I think it just dies before it can open its eyes and stare at the world.
I don't know if this is exactly related, but to our theme for the evening and the subject of your book, so much of what is answered in this book about, you know, why I write is to me this long series of questions and mysteries. You know, you have a story of a little kid and a slightly bigger kid and a 15-year-old who's full of goofy ideas, and the kid's asking profound questions which the child can't answer, but we can speculate on. And these all add up to this is why to write. You could spend a lifetime trying to answer some of the questions that this 5-year-old and this 9-year-old are asking, which is quite different from the masculine, historical imperative and so on. And I don't know if this speaks to what you're talking about writing that's insufficiently open, insufficiently questioning.
Yes, I mean, I think we're only as interesting as the questions we ask. And it's really not so much why I write, but how I write at the end of the day.
Bill, there's something you say about your book of memoir. You say that memoirs as a genre are morally blurred. So in reflecting about what you've just done in this book, what are your moral qualms about writing a volume of memoir like this?
Yeah. Well, basically, it's not only because I'm a journalist, but it comes into high relief if you're a journalist, where you spend your life, talking to people, interviewing people. We're on the record, and everybody understands you're talking for publication, for attribution. And whereas memoir is just, this is private life. You're just arrogating to yourself this right. I'm going to write about it. Everything was off the record. Your life, my life, I assume your life is also off the record. With all these shared moments with friends and loved ones, and you've decided I'm going to write about it without permission. And that's just ethically very, very delicate, to say the least. And in my case, it means going back to people and saying, do you remember this, and how do you remember it, and kind of going over the episodes I'm planning to write about. And of course, they remember it completely differently over and over. It's like you're telling stories from different from different planets. And so you have to try to reconcile this, like why their story is so different from yours, their memory, and negotiate a kind of shared, an agreed version, and get people's permission. Often, their private lives. And some of those negotiations are quite difficult, and you're having to, it's not at all like being a journalist. It's very different. But as I say, my work as a journalist informs my unease.
But memoir isn't necessarily introspective. Look at Lima Barretta. You could say, you can offer a critique, both of your own subjectivities and the culture you find yourself in. I wondered what you think of this quote, actually, that I have in my essay. It's by Friedrich Nietzsche, and I thought it was interesting because I, at first, was quite embarrassed about writing a memoir. So I was sort of trying to look for some quotes to pick me up. So this is Nietzsche, and it's from Beyond Good and Evil. I have gradually come to understand what every great philosophy until now has been, the confession of its author and a kind of involuntary, unconscious memoir.
This is autobiographical. Your essay is autobiographical, but you are very scrupulous in not necessarily identifying some of the people who float through.
I think the most important thing is to find a voice with the reader, a conversation with the reader that's intimate and formal, and to work between this intimacy and this formality. That's the main point of writing, the hardest thing to crack, when you write. But I like the first person, I. You have to commit to it, but who is the I?
Yes.
But that question about to whom your first loyalty goes, okay? Is it because you have a relationship with the reader, obviously, that in the kind of work I do for the New Yorker, for instance, is primary. People know what I'm doing as I report, and now it's between me and the reader. And we've agreed the subjects of my story, and it's between me and the reader. But with memoir, I find it quite different. The reader is the stranger to whom I'm introducing my intimates, and the terms are quite different. I'm not sure where my loyalties lie. So.
It's Gertrude Stein, isn't it, the American writer? She was asked, who do you write for? She said, for myself and for strangers.
Myself and?
For strangers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're coming close to the end of our session, but I wanted to finish by asking about sort of language and the way you both build up language in your work. I mean, Bill, I learned a whole new vocabulary in reading about surfing, and I wondered how much of that is kind of a surfing vernacular, you know, slang, or how much of it is writerly observation.
It's mostly this tribal language, this surfing vernacular. I mean, a lot of it's kind of technical, a lot of it's metaphoric, but it's not very much of its original. And I get credit that I don't deserve. People will say, oh, you know, you describe waves, you know, 40 different food metaphors. Amazing. And I think every single one is a cliche. You know, in surfing, you know, we'll say a wave is meaty, for instance, in what I read out earlier. But there are 40 more food metaphors that surfers use. And it's technical. They know what they mean. They say, was it buttery? It was pretty buttery. You know, and that's like the discussion. How buttery was it? This is not an original food metaphor with me, but with the readership, I get credit for it. So,
Deborah, I mean, you handle language with sort of great precision and deliberation, and your metaphors are astonishing. So tell me about your approach.
I don't have one approach. It depends on the question. But in Swimming Home, what began to interest me, the new thing about language that began to interest me is what we leave out of the story. Because if I tell you all about my father, you might say, well, do you have a mother? So it's who we leave out of the stories that often are that's kind of the most interesting character. So I'm interested in absent characters. And then I just get an obsession. So with Swimming Home, I became interested in this word, etc. Is etc. in Portuguese? So etc., the Latin word for and other things. And I wondered what would happen if you put etc. into a poem. Because Swimming Home is about a fragile young woman called Kitty Finch, who arrives with a poem called Swimming Home, which she gives to this famous British male poet who has big problems in his own life with love, because he was abandoned when he was 5 by his parents, who were Jewish in Poland, where he was born. And they told him, you can never come home, because he was going to escape. He was going to be taken to Britain, and his parents would die in the death camps. So when we say, you can never come home, that's usually said in anger. But it's said to him by his father with love, because he can't come home, and he never sees his parents again. So Kitty Finch writes this poem, and she wants him to read it. And I thought, do I want it to be a really knockout, beautiful poem, or something ambiguous, where the reader says, is she good? Maybe she is, maybe she isn't. And so I just wrote 3 lines. Kitty writes, my mother says I'm the only jewel in her crown, but now I've made her tired with all my etc. So now she walks with sticks. I was playing around with that. 。 . 。 。 。 。 。 。 .
Yeah. 。 .
。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 .
. 。 . 。 . 。 . So, Deborah, Bill, I know this audience will sort of go and sort of swim through some of the ideas you've put in front of us, or maybe even surf on these ideas. But thank you very much, both. Thank you, Bill and Deborah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.